They say the night before a storm is always the quietest. But on the coast of Normandy, that quiet was unnatural. Too still. Too perfect. The kind of silence that makes a man feel the world is holding its breath. It was June 6th, 1944. The night was heavy, the air damp and cold. Across the English Channel, an armada of 5,000 ships was already on the move. But the men inside the German bunkers didn't know that yet. For them, it was just another endless night on the Atlantic Wall. Corporal Ernst Weber sat on an ammunition crate, writing by candlelight. He was 24 years old, a baker's son from Hamburg. He had once dreamed of owning a small cafe near the river. Instead, he found himself locked inside a concrete box, waiting for an enemy he had never seen. He wrote in his notebook, "It smells of damp stone and fear. If this place has a heartbeat, it beats like a clock counting down." Every sound echoed inside the bunker. The hum of the generator, the drip of water from the ceiling, the wind pressing against the steel door. Outside, waves crashed against the cliffs, steady and slow. Weber listened to them and wondered if he would live to see the next sunrise. His commander, Lieutenant Karl Hintz, stood near the observation slit, staring into the fog. He had been fighting since the first days of the war. He was a man of discipline, not cruelty. His hair had begun to turn gray, his eyes hollow from years of exhaustion. He knew this war was slipping away, one defeat at a time. He said quietly, "If they come tonight, we will do what we can. But God help us if they truly come." The Atlantic Wall was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress built to stop the greatest invasion ever imagined. But the men inside knew the truth. The bunkers leaked when it rained. Ammunition was short. Half their guns were rusting from the salt air. And most of them were not elite soldiers, just ordinary men pulled from farms and factories. Weber folded his notebook shut and looked at the narrow slit in the concrete wall. Beyond it was nothing but darkness and the whisper of the sea. He thought about home, about his mother's kitchen, about the smell of bread baking in the oven. He tried to remember her voice, but it had already faded in his memory. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the radio operator called out, "Herr Lieutenant, we're picking up something on the northern frequency." Hintz stepped forward. The signal was faint, just static at first. Then came fragments of English words, lost in the noise. Coded transmissions. Movement across the channel. The lieutenant listened and then said quietly, "So, it begins." Weber looked at him, unsure if he meant it as a warning or prophecy. Minutes passed. The men moved with uneasy silence. Some checked their weapons, others cleaned their boots or lit cigarettes to calm their nerves. Smoke filled the air, thick and stale. Outside, the wind began to shift. A faint mist rolled in from the sea, carrying the scent of salt and oil. It clung to the men's uniforms and made them shiver. Weber stepped outside for a moment, pulling his coat tighter. He squinted into the darkness. The horizon looked strange, alive with faint flashes of light. At first he thought it was lightning. Then he realized those were not storms. Those were guns. He ran back inside. "Artillery fire!" he said, breathless. The commander's face hardened. "How far?" "Maybe 20 kilometers, maybe less. The whole northern sector!" The floor trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. The sound grew louder, rolling like thunder across the coast. The invasion had begun somewhere nearby. The men scrambled into position. They loaded belts of ammunition, adjusted scopes, and waited for orders. Every heart pounded with the same question. Would the enemy land here? The clock on the wall read 4:30 when the radio operator came alive again. Reports flooded in from other sectors. Parachutes had been sighted inland, hundreds of them. British and American soldiers were dropping behind the lines. One man whispered, "They're everywhere." No one replied. Weber opened his notebook again. His handwriting trembled. He wrote, "The sky is full of shadows. They fall silently, like ghosts." The explosions moved closer. The air grew heavier with the smell of gunpowder. The entire bunker seemed to breathe with the rhythm of distant battle. Lieutenant Hintz peered through his binoculars. He saw movement in the fog, long, dark shapes gliding across the water. He wiped his lens, blinked, and froze. "There," he said softly. "Look there." The others crowded around the narrow slit. The horizon was no longer empty. It was filled with ships, dozens, then hundreds, stretching across the sea. At first, it seemed impossible. The mind refused to accept it. But as the light of dawn began to rise, the truth came into view. The entire horizon was moving. Weber whispered, "It looks like the sea itself is alive." No one spoke for a long time. Then the lieutenant said what everyone already knew. "It's the invasion." For a few seconds, time stood still. The men felt weightless, like ghosts watching their own fate unfold. Then reality snapped back with the whistle of incoming shells. The first explosion hit several hundred meters down the coast. The second landed closer. The entire bunker shook, lights flickered. A cup fell from a table and shattered. Hintz shouted orders over the radio, but the static drowned his voice. The power flickered again, and the generator groaned. The air was filled with the echo of distant naval guns firing in perfect rhythm. The men took their positions. Weber's hands were trembling as he loaded his weapon. He tried to focus on the familiar metal, the weight of it in his palms. He had trained for this moment for years, yet it felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He looked at the faces around him. Boys younger than him, some barely 18. One crossed himself. Another clutched a photograph of his wife and daughter. In that moment, rank didn't matter. They were all just men waiting for death to find them. The lieutenant looked through the observation slit one last time. The first wave of landing craft was approaching the beach. Behind them, he could see the silhouettes of destroyers and battleships, their guns flashing in the early light. He took a deep breath and said quietly, "This is it." Weber closed his eyes. He thought of his home, his mother, his unfinished life. Then he whispered, "If there is a God, let him remember us." Another explosion hit nearby. The bunker roared as sand and debris poured through the vents. The lights went out completely. Someone screamed, someone prayed. And through it all, the lieutenant's voice cut through the darkness. "Hold your fire. Wait for them to come closer." The noise outside grew deafening. The earth shook. The sea turned to smoke. Weber's diary would later end mid-sentence. The last words he ever wrote were simple: "They are coming." And in that bunker, 40 men waited behind the guns as history prepared to crash down upon them. The world would remember the beaches, the heroes, and the victory, but not the men who sat in the shadows, trapped in the concrete silence before the storm. The first shell landed so close that it felt like the world itself had cracked open. A thunderous explosion tore through the dawn air, shaking every inch of the bunker. Dust and smoke filled the corridors. The ground vibrated like it was alive, groaning under the weight of fire and fury. Corporal Ernst Weber fell to his knees, clutching his helmet as chunks of concrete rained down. Someone was shouting, but the words were lost in the chaos. Another shell hit, then another. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress that was supposed to protect them, was being torn apart piece by piece. Lieutenant Hintz stumbled toward the command post. "Get that radio working!" he yelled, but the operator could barely hear him. The static was deafening, mixed with screams and explosions from all sides. Outside, the horizon was nothing but fire. The sea had disappeared behind thick smoke and waves of shell bursts. Ships, massive, endless, were pounding the coastline with everything they had. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, each shot slicing the morning sky in half. Weber pressed himself against the wall, his hands trembling. He looked around at the faces of his comrades, pale, terrified, covered in dust. One of them, Private Vogel, was bleeding from the ear but still loading ammunition into the MG-42. His lips were moving, maybe praying, maybe cursing. The lieutenant shouted again, "Positions! Get ready! They're landing!" Weber crawled to his gun emplacement and looked through the narrow opening. The sight froze his blood. Hundreds of landing craft were racing toward the shore, gray shapes cutting through the smoke and waves, packed with soldiers, thousands of them. "They're coming straight for us," someone yelled. The German guns opened up. The machine guns screamed to life, their barrels glowing red within minutes. Tracers ripped through the mist, slicing into the waves and the boats charging forward. For a brief moment, the sound of German fire drowned out the thunder of naval guns. Bodies hit the water. Boats burst into flames. Screams echoed over the roar of engines. But still, the enemy kept coming, wave after wave. It didn't matter how many fell, the next kept advancing. Weber's hands burned on the metal grip. He fired until his gun jammed, then slammed it again and again until it clicked back to life. He didn't even realize he was screaming until his voice cracked. "Reload!" Weber shouted beside him. "Keep firing!" The beach was a nightmare. Smoke, fire, men running in every direction. The water had turned red, and still the ships kept firing. Every explosion sent shockwaves through the bunker, each one closer than the last. Hinz moved between the positions, shouting commands, keeping what little order he could. He knew they were doomed, but his voice never wavered. At one point, a shell hit the observation post directly above them. The roof caved in. Weber threw himself to the floor as debris rained down. When he looked up, half the room was gone. And so were two of his friends. Silence lasted only seconds before another barrage began. The lieutenant shouted, "Fall back to secondary position!" But where could they fall back to? There was nowhere left to go. The bunker was shaking apart. The corridor lights flickered, then went out completely. The only illumination came from flashes of explosions outside. Weber stumbled through the smoke, coughing. His ears rang, his eyes burned. He found the radio operator slumped against the wall, blood trickling from his head. The radio itself was shattered, sparks flying from the broken wires. "Can he fix it?" Weber asked. The man looked up, dazed, and shook his head. "It's gone." Outside, the sounds grew louder. The enemy had reached the cliffs. The first grenades landed near the bunker entrance, followed by bursts of automatic fire. "They're here!" someone screamed. The German guns opened up. The machine guns screamed to life, their barrels glowing red within minutes. Tracers ripped through the mist, slicing into the waves and the boats charging forward. For a brief moment, the sound of German fire drowned out the thunder of naval guns. Bodies hit the water. Boats burst into flames. Screams echoed over the roar of engines. But still, the enemy kept coming, wave after wave. It didn't matter how many fell, the next kept advancing. Weber's hands burned on the metal grip. He fired until his gun jammed, then slammed it again and again until it clicked back to life. He didn't even realize he was screaming until his voice cracked. "Reload!" Weber shouted beside him. "Keep firing!" The beach was a nightmare. Smoke, fire, men running in every direction. The water had turned red. And still, the ships kept firing. Every explosion sent shockwaves through the bunker, each one closer than the last. Hinz moved between the positions, shouting commands, keeping what little order he could. He knew they were doomed, but his voice never wavered. At one point, a shell hit the observation post directly above them. The roof caved in. Weber threw himself to the floor as debris rained down. When he looked up, half the room was gone. And so were two of his friends. Silence lasted only seconds before another barrage began.
The lieutenant shouted, "Fall back to secondary position!" But where could they fall back to? There was nowhere left to go. The bunker was shaking apart. The corridor lights flickered, then went out completely. The only illumination came from flashes of explosions outside. Weber stumbled through the smoke, coughing. His ears rang, his eyes burned. He found the radio operator slumped against the wall, blood trickling from his head. The radio itself was shattered, sparks flying from the broken wires. "Can you fix it?" Weber asked. The man looked up, dazed, and shook his head. "It's gone." Outside, the sounds grew louder. The enemy had reached the cliffs. The first grenades landed near the bunker entrance, followed by bursts of automatic fire. "They're here!" someone screamed. Weber grabbed his rifle and took position behind a concrete barricade. He could see dark figures moving through the smoke, American soldiers advancing cautiously, covering each other as they moved up the slope. For the first time, he saw their faces. Not the faceless enemy from posters or speeches, but real men, young, determined, terrified, just like him. He fired. One fell. Another kept coming. The noise was unbearable. Metal against stone, bullets tearing through the air, screams echoing through the tunnels. Inside the bunker, the air grew thick with smoke and dust. Every breath tasted like blood and gunpowder. Weber yelled, "They're flanking us!" They returned. He saw movement on the side entrance. Grenades rolled in. He dived to the ground. The blast threw him into the wall. Everything went black for a moment. His ears buzzed like a swarm of bees. When his vision cleared, he saw what was left of Weber, motionless under a pile of rubble. Something inside Weber broke. He didn't feel fear anymore, only emptiness. He grabbed another weapon and kept firing into the smoke, screaming until his throat tore. The lieutenant's voice still came through, hoarse but steady. "Hold the line! Don't let them breach!" But they were already inside. He could hear footsteps, shouting in English. The sound of gunfire echoed through the corridors. Weber ducked behind cover, his rifle empty. He reached for a new clip, but found none. His hands were shaking too much to reload anyway. He looked around. The others were gone. Some dead, some retreating deeper into the bunker. Then he saw the lieutenant. Hin stood in the center of the room, pistol in hand, firing until the last bullet was gone. When the Americans stormed in, he didn't raise his hands. He simply stood there, silent, defiant, as the fight ended in an instant. Weber dropped his weapon. His body was trembling, his lungs burning. The battle outside still raged, but inside this bunker, it was over. An American soldier shouted something he couldn't understand. Another one motioned for him to get down. He didn't resist. His knees gave way, and he sank to the floor, staring blankly at the smoke curling through the broken ceiling. The sound of battle faded, replaced by the hum of the sea and the cries of the wounded. The great fortress had fallen, just like all the others that morning. Hours later, as the smoke cleared, the Americans walked through the ruins. Bodies lay everywhere, German and American alike. The price of a few hundred meters of sand. One of the soldiers found Weber still alive, barely conscious, clutching a small notebook against his chest. The notebook that held his final words, written in a shaky hand. He had managed to write one last line before losing consciousness. It wasn't bravery. It was survival. The soldier took the notebook and placed it in his pocket. He didn't know who this man was or what he had seen, but somehow he felt it mattered. That night, as the beach finally grew quiet, the tide washed over the ruins of the bunker. The sea erased the footprints, the blood, the scars of battle. But deep inside the broken concrete, the echoes of that day never truly faded. They lingered.
When the guns finally fell silent, the air still trembled with their memory. The beach that had been alive with chaos only hours before now lay in an eerie stillness. Smoke drifted over the sand like a slow-moving fog, covering everything in a gray haze. The sea was calm again, but it carried secrets. Helmets, rifles, broken boats, and the bodies of men who would never go home. Ernst Weber opened his eyes to the soft sound of waves. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was cracked, light spilling through holes torn by the bombardment. The walls were black with soot. The smell of burned metal and blood was everywhere. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his shoulder. He had been hit by shrapnel. His uniform was torn, caked with dust and dried blood. Around him, the bunker was silent. The others were gone. He looked toward the entrance. 2 American soldiers stood guard outside, their silhouettes outlined by the pale morning light. They were young, no older than him. One of them looked nervous, holding his rifle too tightly, as if afraid the war might start again at any second. Weber didn't speak. He simply stared at the floor, at the fragments of his broken world. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, revealing the true face of the battlefield. The beaches of Normandy were a graveyard now. Wrecked landing craft lay half buried in the sand. The tide had pulled bodies into the shallows, only to return them gently to the shore. Every few minutes, another explosion echoed from inland, small skirmishes still raging as the Allies pushed deeper into France. But here, by the coast, it was over. The war had moved on, leaving behind only silence and smoke. An American medic entered the bunker. He crouched beside Weber and checked his pulse. "He's still alive," the medic said quietly to the others. "Get him to the aid post." Weber tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his mind heavy. They lifted him onto a stretcher. As they carried him outside, sunlight hit his face for the first time in days. He winced. The world seemed too bright, too unreal. He looked around as they carried him down the slope. The scene was something out of another world. Tanks rolling off landing craft, endless lines of soldiers marching inland, cranes lifting supplies, bulldozers clearing wreckage. The entire coastline had turned into a machine of war, efficient and unstoppable. Weber turned his head and saw the bunker from a distance. Smoke still rose from its roof. The flag that once hung from the post was gone, torn to shreds. The mighty Atlantic Wall, once the pride of the Reich, now looked like a scar across the land, a monument to arrogance and failure. He whispered something under his breath, too soft for anyone to hear. Days passed. The prisoners were gathered in makeshift camps along the coast. Weber was one of thousands, disarmed, wounded, silent. The Americans treated them with a strange mix of caution and pity. They gave them food, water, bandages, and sometimes even cigarettes. Weber sat on the ground, staring at the horizon. He couldn't stop hearing the sounds of that morning, the thunder of ships, the screams, the endless roar of guns. They played in his mind over and over like an echo that refused to fade. One evening, a young American guard sat beside him. He looked barely 19. He handed Weber a tin cup filled with coffee. "You were in that bunker, weren't you?" the soldier asked. Weber nodded slowly. The boy looked out toward the sea. "You guys fought hard. Didn't think anyone could survive that kind of fire." Weber didn't answer. He didn't know how. After a moment, the American said, "My brother was in one of those boats. I haven't heard if he made it." Weber looked at him for the first time. Their eyes met. In that moment, the lines between enemy and friend disappeared. They were just 2 young men, both caught in something far larger than themselves. He wanted to say he was sorry, but the words felt empty. So he said nothing at all. Weeks later, Weber was transported to a prisoner camp in England. It was clean, orderly, quiet. Too quiet. He spent most of his days staring at the clouds, wondering how many of his friends had made it out alive. No one knew. The names faded faster than the memories. At night, he dreamed of the bunker, the endless rumble of artillery,
the flashes of light, the screams of his comrades. He would wake up gasping for air, his hands shaking, sweat running down his face. But when he looked around, there was no sound, only the wind moving gently through the trees outside. Years later, long after the war ended, Weber returned to Normandy as an old man. He came alone, walking slowly along the same cliffs where he had once fought. The bunkers were still there, silent, cold, overgrown with grass and moss. Tourists walked around, taking pictures, laughing, unaware of what had happened inside those walls. Weber stood before the ruins of his old post. He touched the concrete, his fingers tracing the cracks left by shells. It felt colder than he remembered. He closed his eyes and could still hear it. The noise, the shouting, the chaos. But beneath it all, he heard something else. The faint sound of waves, steady and endless, washing away the footprints of the past. He whispered to himself, "It was supposed to be our wall of defense, but it became our tomb." He took out a small notebook from his coat, the same one he had written in all those years ago. The pages were yellowed and fragile. Inside, his handwriting was faint, but still readable. He turned to the last page and wrote one final line. The war ended long ago, but the ghosts never left. He placed the notebook inside a crack in the bunker wall and walked away. The wind carried the sound of the sea up the cliffs, gentle and calm, as if nature itself was whispering a prayer for all who had fallen there. German, American, British, all the same in death. The guns were gone, but the echoes remained. And for those who listened closely, Normandy still spoke in the language of ghosts.
Decades had passed since the guns fell silent on the beaches of Normandy. The bunkers stood still, weathered and gray, slowly succumbing to the creeping sea air and the weight of time. Moss and vines clung to the concrete walls, and tourists wandered through, unaware of the blood and fear that once filled these rooms. Ernst Weber, now an old man, returned one last time. His hands trembled as he touched the rough surface of the bunker he had once called home. Memories rushed back. The noise, the fire, the screams of comrades he would never forget. For a moment, he was a young man again, crouched behind a gun, staring at the endless sea, waiting for death. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the fragile notebook he had kept all those years. The pages were brittle, but the words remained. Lines written in hurried, shaking handwriting, chronicling fear, confusion, and the small acts of courage that no history book would ever record. Reading the diary, he remembered faces, friends who had fallen, strangers who had shown compassion even in the midst of chaos. He remembered the moments when hope seemed almost impossible, and yet, in the smallest gestures, it survived. A shared cigarette, a whispered joke, a helping hand. Weber placed the notebook back into the bunker, hidden in a small crack in the wall. It was a piece of history no one would read, yet it mattered. For in those pages lay the truth of the human heart behind the guns, fear and bravery, despair and defiance, life and death, intertwined in a way that the world outside would never understand. As he stepped away, the wind carried the faint sound of the sea up the cliffs. The waves washed against the rocks, constant and unyielding, like time itself, erasing footprints, but never the memory. Weber paused for a moment, looking back at the bunkers one last time. He whispered softly, "We were forgotten, but we were here. We lived, we fought, we survived, or we tried." And with that, he turned and walked down the cliffside, leaving the Atlantic wall to stand as a silent witness.
The wind, the waves, and the empty bunkers held the echoes of a past that had shaped a world. A story of men trapped in steel and concrete, of battles fought both outside and within. History remembered the victors, the heroes, the monumental victories, but the diaries, the personal stories of fear, courage, and survival remained hidden, waiting for someone to listen. The bunkers were quiet again. The guns were gone. The war was long over. Yet in the shadows and in the stones, the memories whispered, telling anyone who would hear the true story of those who had stood behind the guns. And for Ernst Weber, and for all the men who had waited in the cold, dark bunkers that morning, it was enough to know that someone, somewhere, might finally remember.